A little girl lived alone by the river. Each morning she brewed a bowl of tea and placed it on the table across from an empty chair. No one asked who she was waiting for. There was only the sound of flowing water, the wind whispering through the wooden roof, and golden light slanting into the hut like strands of thread trying to hold one more day together. Until one afternoon when a dry branch snapped across the river. Another girl, limping, wearing patched clothes, her eyes cold like the end of autumn, stood there. She said nothing. She did not move. She simply looked, as if she too had once sat before an empty chair. No words were spoken, no names exchanged, but that night the hut's door stayed open, and from that moment on, the fire began to burn in a place no one called home. But anyone who stepped inside found it hard to leave. Part 1. The Morning Tea Bowl. Some mornings passed like a still river, no ripples, no names called, just a fine mist clinging to the window pane, cold ashes in the fireplace, and the soft crackle of dry wood under bare feet. May woke early, as always. She had no clock and needed no reminder. The first light of day slipping through the roof's cracks and brushing her eyelids was enough. That was when everything in the little cabin seemed to come alive again. Just once more. The cabin had been built by her grandmother 30 years ago, back when land was cheap and folks trusted each other more than they trusted money. It stood tucked beside the Rattlesnake River, a place where waters roared in spring and slept like a wool blanket come winter. The walls were hand-joined planks. The tin roof sloped low, warm enough to survive, never enough to truly hide from the cold. Inside there were only 3 things that still bore the mark of the old woman: a tattered wool blanket, a thick book with a peeling cover, and a set of porcelain tea bowls, only one of which remained intact. Every morning May boiled water in a black iron kettle. The fire crackled, steam rose. She didn't rush, nor did she linger. Her hands moved with the quiet rhythm of someone who knew what needed doing to give the day a reason to begin. When the water boiled, she poured 2 bowls, one for herself and one for the one who was gone. The second bowl was always placed beside the chair across from her. That chair, with a broken leg, had been steadied by a sliver of bark, just as her grandmother once said, "That bit of wood holds the chair up, the same way you hold me up, little one." May hadn't understood back then. Now she did. Some things, though no longer present, still keep us from falling. She didn't drink right away. She would just sit there, blow gently on the steam, and watch the light pattern on the floor, pale and thin, like memory. Outside, the river murmured softly, as if conversing with someone May had never met. Occasionally, a sparrow would land on the windowsill, then flit away, as naturally as all things that come and go. No one knocked at the door. No one passed by. No footprints were left on the damp trail. There was only May, 9 years old, with a small back and hands that knew how to grip an axe, start a fire, and bury a cat when it died during the coldest winter. The townsfolk 3 miles away thought of her as something odd. A child who lived alone, who neither cried nor laughed, who begged nothing, who demanded nothing. They didn't know that what an orphan feared most wasn't hunger. It was being a bother to the living. She still went to church every Sunday, always sitting in the back pew. When someone spoke to her, she nodded. If someone gave her bread, she accepted it, never ate it on the spot. Some said, "That child doesn't need anyone," but none of them knew. She needed just one person, someone kind enough to stay without asking why she still poured tea for someone who wasn't there. On windless days, May would walk along the riverbank, gather firewood, check her traps, and sit beneath the old willow. That was where her grandmother once told stories about when she was young rode horses, crossed ridges, and feared no one but herself. Now only the roots curled above the earth, like twisted fingers waiting for a hand to hold. One morning, while washing her face in the river, she saw her reflection, gaunt face, brittle hair, dark circles under her eyes. But what she stared at longest was her neck, the place where the woolen necklace used to rest. Now empty. She touched it gently, then bent down and washed her face again, the cold water whispering, "No one's going to call your name today, little one." But she returned home, lit the stove, and brewed the tea again. The second bowl was always full, the chair always occupied, in her memory. So if anyone had happened to walk by that river at dawn, they might have seen a strange sight. A small girl sitting properly at an old wooden table, 2 tea bowls placed between them, and silence filling the room like water in a cup. Not sorrowful, not tragic, just the kind of loneliness that no longer hurts. As if surviving was her job now, and every morning brewing tea was how she told her grandmother. I'm still here. Part 2. The Ones Who Never Came Back. May had spent hours standing at the cabin door, eyes following the dirt trail leading to town. It wasn't a busy path, just a few hunched riders now and then, their saddlebags full of pelts or dried potatoes. They moved fast, never glancing back, as if this stretch of land was merely something to cross, never a place worth stopping for. Everyone in the village knew she was there. The little girl of Mrs. Shaw, the old woman who lived by the river, who kept to herself, but was sought out by anyone with a broken arm, a snake bite, or a fever. She healed with roots, with ash, with trembling hands as firm as oak. When she passed the previous winter, the priest gave word. A carpenter came to build the coffin. And then no one else came. They told May, "If you need anything, come to town." May nodded, but she never went. She knew well. The town held nothing for her but quick glances and turned heads, the kind of look adults gave things they didn't know what to do with. Not pitiable enough to save, not dirty enough to throw away. Just there. At first, someone brought her a sack of flour, a jar of honey. She bowed, said thank you, accepted them, and left them untouched on the table. When they saw the gifts unused, they stopped bringing more. One woman once asked, "Why don't you go live with relatives?" May said nothing. She had once heard her grandmother say their family was far away, and there's no need to return to a place that forgot you before you ever left. So she lived as her grandmother had, with enough, not lacking, but never more. She sharpened the little axe hanging by the stove every week. Firewood was split evenly and stacked just so. Her hunting knife was cleaned after each use and wrapped in old cloth. The wool blanket she folded each morning, placed neatly under her pillow, as if someone might inspect it. No one inspected anything. No one came inside. No one ever asked, "Were you cold last night?" So everything in that cabin, from the way bandages were tied to how cloths were folded, came from memory, not instruction, from watching, not being told. She didn't cry. She didn't whine. She didn't even talk to herself anymore like she had in the early days after her grandmother died. People in town thought her strong. Once Mrs. Dawson, the egg seller, Lano, said, "That girl's like a wild colt. Doesn't cry, doesn't ask." But they didn't know. Orphans don't choose to be strong. They just know. If they're not, who will hold them up? One night, wind slammed the wooden door open. May didn't get up. She just curled tighter under the blanket, eyes on the ceiling, hands clutching the porcelain bowl handle. In the morning, she lit the fire, cooked thin porridge, poured 2 bowls of tea like she always did. The second bowl sat across from her, untouched. One day she found an old cloth doll in the drawer her grandmother used to lock. It was moldy, missing one eye, patched with black thread. May sewed it up and placed it on the table. Not knowing what to call it, she whispered, "Grandma." "Didn't feel right. She tried, Mama?" The word slipped from her lips so awkwardly, she lowered her head in embarrassment. Since then, the doll had no name. It just sat there, a silent third presence at the table between May and the cold bowl. Anyone passing the muddy trail might have found it strange. A little girl living alone, tending everything as if waiting for someone to return, though clearly no one would. No cat scratched at the door. No one crossed the river to visit. No drawings on the walls. No stories told at night. And though spring had come, the cabin still smelled of winter, of someone who wasn't waiting anymore but still set 2 bowls. Maybe somewhere deep inside May she still believed, if one day someone wandered past and saw the empty place at the table, they might stop, and she wouldn't be the one to speak first. All she needed was for them to sit down. Part 3. A small snap in the golden dusk. It wasn't thunder, wasn't gunfire, just the snap of a branch that made her look up. It was a late spring afternoon. The sun had softened, brushing the willows with a smear of gold, like butter. The breeze wandered without purpose, neither cold nor warm, as if the whole world was exhaling after a long season of snow. May was down by the river gathering firewood just like every evening. She bound the bundle tight with a short rope, axe slung over one shoulder, bare hands, bare feet. Sand clung thick to her soles with each step, but she didn't mind. Something about this wild land made a person stop thinking about what stuck to their skin and start remembering what was missing in their heart. She bent to pick up a dry branch when the sound came. So faint, so clean. Crack, as if someone had stepped on a twig, right across the river. May froze. The wind stopped, or maybe everything did inside her. The Rattlesnake River wasn't wide, but it was wide enough to split the world in two. On the other side lay forest, thick, dark, and often whispered about in town as the side no one should go. There were faint trails, hollowed trees, and paths that disappeared into nowhere. And there, she saw a figure, a girl about her age, walking slowly through the slanted light. Her clothes were patched in many places, stained with dirt. She clutched her knee, dragging her right leg, leaving a faint trail in the soil behind her. She didn't sit, didn't call out, just stopped, standing tall, with the strange pride of a child who had grown too familiar with pain. The breeze shifted gently, and between the two girls, each on one bank, their hair lifted and drifted toward one another. May didn't know what to do. Her fingers still held the rope, the bundle still on her back, her heart beating slow, then fast, then slow again. She couldn't remember the last time someone had looked directly at her like that. Not with pity, not avoidance. Just looked, quiet, raw, as if they saw each other clear as day without a single word. A mockingbird flew past, chirping 3 sharp notes, then vanished. The girl on the other side didn't move, didn't gesture, but those eyes, dark, hollow, filled with grit and weariness, kept May rooted to the spot. Maybe if she'd been an adult, she would have felt fear, or at least caution, like Grandma used to say. Never trust someone who doesn't call your name in a familiar voice. But May hadn't learned all the things her grandmother meant to teach. She only knew this. The girl standing across the river looked lonelier than she did. May still had a teapot, a blanket, a cabin. That girl had nothing, just a swollen knee, dirt-covered hands, and a silent question in her eyes. "Are you kind enough not to look away?" May didn't answer, didn't wave, just stood there, long enough for the sun to change colors, gold to amber, then slowly into violet. Finally, as if to ground herself in something real, May bent down and picked up another branch. She tied it to the bundle, then turned to leave. Not in a rush, but without hesitation. No glance back, just a look, held long enough to last a lifetime. Part 4. Crossing the river without moving. Many lose each other in words. These two children found each other in a gaze that outlasted sunlight. May returned with her firewood, stacked it neatly beside the hearth. The sun had dipped behind the low birch trees, leaving a pale gray sheen over everything, turning the inside of the cabin into a world of paper cutouts and shadows. She told no one about the girl she'd seen across the river. Didn't even ask herself why she hadn't been afraid. Questions, somehow, felt unnecessary. She lit the fire with the twigs she'd gathered. The scent of pine resin burned slow, curling through the air. May hung the black kettle on the iron hook, poured water into 2 familiar bowls, one for herself, one for her grandmother. Her hands didn't shake, but her pouring was slower than usual, as if she was listening for a sound that wasn't quite real. Was the girl still there? No one knew, and even if May had wanted to check to see just once more, she didn't. Instead, she did something strange. She poured a 3rd bowl, a bowl with no one sitting across from it, no chair set aside, just placed beside her own, as if she was willing to share but hadn't found the courage to invite. There were only 3 bowls, and from that evening on, the cabin held 3 sources of warmth. Night fell. Wind slipped through the doorframe. The fire dimmed, flickering red across the walls like hands reaching out for warmth. May sat at the table, opened her grandmother's old book, but didn't read. She ran her fingers along the worn pages, sometimes closing her eyes as if waiting for her grandmother's voice to rise from between the lines. But silence was always the one that stayed the longest. And then, like every night, she locked the door with the wooden bar, blew out the lamp, and curled under her blanket in the corner of her little bed. Outside, the river still flowed, soft, steady, stubborn like memory. Somewhere around midnight, she woke. The wind had shifted. There was a smell. Not the musty old wood smell she knew so well, but the scent of cold skin, damp earth, and a breath that didn't belong to her. May didn't panic, didn't scream. She simply listened. Outside, there was no sound, no knock, nothing. But not quite no one. She hadn't locked the door. Her grandmother never had, and May followed suit, an unwritten promise kept quietly. The cabin door stood slightly ajar, though the wind wasn't strong, just a narrow gap, as if someone had touched it, then stopped. May didn't get up, didn't go near. She simply lay there, curled tightly, waiting for something to come closer, if it needed to. At first light, before dawn broke, May opened the door. On the porch was a small, wet footprint, tilted as if one leg hadn't held weight. It faced toward the cabin, not away. On the railing, a broken twig, just like the sound she'd heard the night before. And beneath the old willow, where the dew hadn't yet lifted, were faint marks in the soft earth, as if a small hand had tried to push itself up, then sank again. May said nothing. She stepped inside, lit the fire, and made another bowl of tea, this time placing it directly across from her seat. It wasn't the bowl for the dead, nor yet the bowl for the living. It was just a bowl for someone hurting enough to stay. Part 5. The intruder who collapsed at the door. Not a thief, not a wolf, just the sound of a ragged breath. And then silence. That night, the sky was dry, but the dew was so heavy the front step felt soaked, as if someone had stood there a long while, unmoving. May lay still in bed, eyes open, blanket pulled to her chin. The fire had died when the moon reached its peak, leaving only a faint red glow in the coals, like the eyes of something watching quietly through the wooden slats. No wind, no owl, only the kind of silence known by those who've lived alone long enough to recognize it, not the silence of books nor of churches, but of presence, before it reveals itself. Then, like a snapped string in the world's rhythm, thud, not loud, but heavy. The sound of a body falling, not iron, not wood. Flesh. May sat up, not afraid, just cold. The kind of cold that settles at the neck, where people wear scarves when they know they're about to face something they can't name. She wrapped the blanket tighter, rose, and walked to the door. The coals in the hearth stayed silent behind her. The door, like every night since her grandmother passed, hung ajar, never opened by anyone, never welcoming anyone until now. May's small hand pressed the wooden latch, pushed gently, and moonlight spilled in. There, on the doorstep, the native girl lay curled in on herself, right leg swollen thick as a young tree trunk, hands gripping a long stick. Whether as a weapon or a final support, no one could say. Her face was streaked with mud, hair tangled like storm-thrashed weeds, her forehead damp with sweat despite the cold. Her shirt was torn from shoulder to hip, not from fighting, but from thorns, from branches, from the forest that did not want to let go. She breathed faintly, each exhale thin as thread, and then she didn't. Not dead, just no longer resisting the pull of sleep. May didn't ask questions, didn't scream, didn't run for the adults, even though town was only 3 miles away and the blacksmith's oil lamp still burned on Friday nights. She simply sat down, rewrapped the blanket around her own shoulders, and gently, with care, loosened the stick from the girl's fingers. Those fingers resisted, barely, a kind of refusal too weak to become protest. Then they let go. The stick fell to the step, rolled once, and came to rest, pointing toward the woods. May bent down, arms slipping behind the girl's back, lifting her as one would a small wild thing. The girl was light but soft, as if her joints had given up trying to hold themselves together. May carried her across the threshold, and the first thing she did was not bandage the leg nor wipe the dirt away, but pull her grandmother's blanket over her, the same blanket that once covered May when Grandma was alive. Now it covered someone with no name. The girl slept through the night, unmoving, cheek resting against the old rug by the fire, where May had laid her down. Her leg still twitched now and then with fever. May stayed a few paces away, not sleeping. She didn't dare touch the injured leg, nor did she know what to say if the girl opened her eyes. No one had taught May how to greet someone who'd reached your door with nothing left. But in the morning, when the light filtered through the slats and stretched across the floor in long strips, May stepped forward, knelt beside her, and gently untangled the matted hair from the girl's face. And in that small, still moment, their eyes met. No smile, no thank you, no surprise, just a gaze longer than the night they'd just survived. Part 6. 2 Bodies, 1 Fire. No words were spoken. Warmth was the first language of trust. The cabin was the same as always, the scent of smoke, light slipping through the wooden walls, the wind whistling through the cracks in the doorframe. Things so familiar they no longer needed names. But today, there was something new in the air. Someone else was breathing, not loud, not steady, but real. May was up first, quietly lit the fire with the last of the gathered wood. The embers flickered and the glow cast shadows on the walls, shapes like old relatives visiting without knocking, sitting somewhere out of sight. The girl still lay there, on the faded rug by the hearth, her face less pale. No more sweat pouring like the night before. her legs still swollen, but her arms now relaxed, no longer clenched in defense. May fetched the small pot, scooped the last of the rice, dropped in a few leftover roots, made a thin porridge, no meat. But there was salt and thyme. When it was ready, she poured it into a chipped clay bowl, the kind that had a crack on one side, and placed it before the girl. She didn't nudge, didn't speak, just sat half an arm's length away, her own bowl cupped in her hands, blowing softly across the surface. The girl opened her eyes, looked at the bowl, then didn't move. Only after a moment she pressed her palm against the floor, sitting up slowly like someone relearning how to trust that the ground would hold. With her left hand she spooned the porridge. No words, no glances exchanged, but when the first bite touched her lips, both girls exhaled, a breath light as dawn, like the wind last night, just strong enough to push open a door. After breakfast, May cleaned the bowls, scrubbed the pot with sand, and hung it back like always. There was no need to change routine, except now someone else was sleeping under her grandmother's blanket. By noon, sunlight reached across the floor and slid toward the hearth. May added wood to the fire for the first time, splitting it evenly to both sides as if the flame too now belonged to two. She brought out a roll of bandage, a jar of plant salve her grandmother once made, and sat beside the injured leg. She didn't ask permission, didn't warn, just placed her hand gently on the swollen knee. The girl flinched, not in fear, but out of habit, then didn't pull away. The wound was angry red, swollen like sap bleeding from a cut tree, her ankle bruised, knee scraped, not deep, but not light either. May did what had once been done for her, cleaned it with warm water, rubbed in crushed mint leaves, wrapped it in soft, worn cloth. The girl said nothing, didn't groan, just gripped the rug under her, clinging to some shred of control. When May finished, she placed her hand atop the bandage, not for medicine, but because someone had once done that for her, and it had made her feel alive. Neither looked at the other, but they both heard the fire crackling, the only sound allowed between them for now. As dusk fell, the wind shifted. May prepared 2 bowls of porridge. There wasn't much left, so she broke a dry biscuit in half, unevenly, but neither counted the pieces. Side by side, 2 small shapes, one in a brown dress, one in a torn shirt, ate quietly, faces angled toward the fire. Their eyes didn't meet, but their backs leaned ever so slightly in the same direction. That night, May laid out another blanket on the floor. No words, no gestures. The girl understood, pulled the blanket over herself. May blew out the lamp, didn't bolt the door, left it ajar, as always. On the table, 2 clay bowls, one empty, one full. And in the hearth, the fire didn't blaze, but it no longer belonged to just one person. At 7, gestures without names. When language fails, people choose kindness to understand each other. That morning the fog lay heavy, like someone had draped a thick, damp sheet over the roof, muffling the whole cabin in white and chill. The river barely made a sound now, just a whisper from far off, like a memory floating at the edge of hearing. May rose early, rekindled the fire, then stepped quietly toward the rug near the hearth. The strange girl was still asleep, her face turned to the wall, knees tucked to her chest, arms wrapped around them, as if warming herself from the inside. The wool blanket had slipped off her shoulders sometime during the night. May pulled it back up, gently, as if tugging too hard might make the girl disappear. There was no mirror in the cabin, but when the girl finally opened her eyes and looked around for the first time, the look on her face was the same one May had worn the morning her grandmother died. Not panic, not despair, just the stillness of someone who no longer expects anything. May didn't ask questions, didn't offer her name, Instead, she fetched a bowl of warm water, clean cloth, and sat by the injured leg. The girl's eyes followed her every movement. May bent down, unwrapped the bandage, cleaned, applied fresh medicine, not fast, not slow, just steady. When she touched the edge of the wound, the girl winced, but made no sound. Then suddenly, without a word, the girl dipped her finger into the thin layer of dust on the wooden floor and drew a simple shape, a circle with a single curved reed inside. May looked up. The girl met her eyes, silent. May didn't understand, but she dipped her own finger and, beside the symbol, drew the same image, only with a second reed, smaller, leaning against the first. No one smiled, but something shifted in their eyes, as if, from that moment on, they had a language of their own. By midday, the clouds had thinned. The sun was still hidden, but enough light crept in to reveal stray strands of hair, scattered on the floor. May tidied the kitchen corner. The other girl, using her left hand, slow but determined, gathered kindling and stacked it neatly beside the hearth. No one assigned tasks, no one asked for help. But when someone begins to organize what was never theirs, it means they've chosen to stay, at least in spirit. That afternoon, May took out a small box of earth-colored supplies, the old charcoal pieces her grandmother used to mark medicinal trees. Inside were bits of graphite, worn chalk, and half-erased sketches. The girl glanced at it, then slowly extended her hand, asking for one. May passed it wordlessly, and then the girl walked to the wooden wall near the hearth and began to draw. 3 broken strokes made a river. On its bank, 2 small shapes, one sitting, one lying down. May stood behind her, watching. She didn't interrupt. When the girl stepped back and handed her the charcoal, May added a slanted willow branch, arching over the 2 figures. No one had taught them the word symbol, but from that moment on, the room no longer felt like it held 2 strangers. That night, May let the lamp burn a little longer than usual. The girl no longer faced the wall as she slept. She lay, turned toward the hearth, where May rested, head on her grandmother's blanket. No one said good night. No one asked, "Will you leave tomorrow?" Only the wind between the boards, and 2 breaths, one familiar, one becoming familiar. On the wall, the charcoal drawings cast flickering shadows across the floor, and even without words, anyone watching would understand. Some things lose their magic the moment they're named. Part 8. The Days Without Names. They didn't know what day it was, only that the mornings were colder than before. The days that followed passed like drifting fog. No markers, no church bells, no greetings or farewells. Only light shifting across the wooden walls, and the fire rising and falling with the rhythm of 2 breathers. May never asked the girl her name, but in her heart she began to call her Luma, because her eyes reminded May of light slipping through willow leaves at dusk, soft but never faint. Luma didn't speak a word of English, but she began, doing, gathering wood, washing herbs, soaking cloths. Though her leg still limped, her step uneven, her hands were steady, like someone who, having lost faith in paths, holds tightly to whatever small thing she can still do. May showed Luma how to pour water into the kettle without spilling. Luma showed May how to tie rope using a special braided knot, one her grandmother had never taught. No one said who was better, no one scolded for doing it wrong. In that cabin between those 2 girls, a rhythm began to form. Morning, May boiled water. Luma set the wood. Noon, May cooked porridge. Luma divided greens. Evening, one tucked the blanket. The other shut the door quietly. No laughter, no games, but their eyes, when they looked at the fire, no longer held defenses. On the wall beside the hearth, the charcoal sketch grew longer each day. A stream, a tree, a bowl, a small circle with 2 dots inside, like two people sitting around something that didn't need a name, not art, just signs of presence of two souls, once strangers, now breathing to the same rhythm. On the third, or maybe fourth day, it rained. For the first time, May didn't go to the river for firewood. She sat by the window, teacup in hand, watching the raindrops slide across the planks outside the porch. Luma sat beside her, silent, unmoving. Then, slowly, she reached into the pocket of her patched shirt and pulled out a small piece of wood, 2 fingers long, and began to carve, not with a knife, with a smooth stone. May watched. Luma didn't hide it, just bent low, focused. When she was done, she handed it to May. Etched into the wood, in delicate lines, was a small house, 2 figures sitting close together, their hands touching a shared fire. May didn't smile. She only held the carving tightly in her palm, then placed it on the table beside her grandmother's tea bowl. That night, May split the firewood again, added 1 more piece to the left side, where Luma slept. The flames burned evenly. May pulled the blanket up to her chest, eyes still on the fire. Luma lay with her back turned, but gently tugged the edge of the blanket up to her shoulder. 2 small shapes, one lying still, one turned slightly, bathed in red glow across their faces. The drawings on the wall seemed to shift, not because of wind, but because of warmth. As the fire began to dim, May whispered, not aloud, not to anyone in particular, "I don't know what day it is, but I'm not afraid of the dark anymore." Maybe her grandmother heard, or maybe someone else did. Part 9. Horse shadows in the silent noon. Not a mailman, not a townsfolk, but those who leave no tracks. That noon, sunlight spilled across the clearing like honey poured over gauze. Thick, golden, nearly motionless. No wind, no bird song. Even the river, though still flowing, seemed to hold its breath beneath the willow roots. May was slicing dried roots. Luma sat by the wall, carving again with her stone, this time a small tea bowl. No one spoke, but something in the air made both girls look up at the same time, a sound, not loud, not like the heavy gallop of townsfolk horses, not like the clatter of trade wagons. It was a distant resonance, soft, low, like the earth itself exhaling beneath approaching weight. Luma set the carving down, rose to her feet, not alarmed, more like someone who had long expected this day to come. May stepped out onto the porch, squinting toward the forest edge, where sunlight broke and wavered, as if something unseen was slicing through it. And then she saw them. Horses. Many. They did not charge, did not whinny. They moved. Slow, silent, in perfect rhythm. On each back sat a rider, dressed in native attire, dark leather, eagle-feathered hairpieces, faces painted in red, hands resting on spears or bows. None of them glanced around, none spoke, their eyes fixed forward, as if they already knew exactly where they were meant to go. Within minutes they formed a half-circle around the cabin. No shouting, no signals, but every path, front door, back trail, riverside, was quietly closed off. May didn't understand, didn't step back. She simply stood, hand on the doorframe, heart steady, though her back was damp with sweat she hadn't noticed. In her mind echoed her grandmother's voice. If you're ever surrounded, don't think about running. Those who mean harm don't draw circles, they shoot. But these people didn't shoot, they looked, as if they were waiting for something, or someone, to confirm what came next. And that was when Luma stepped outside, still limping, still unsteady. But she didn't hold the wall, didn't lean on May. She stood, arms at her sides, and looked towards the man on the horse at the center of the formation. He wore no eagle feathers, no war paint, just plain leather and rough fabric, but somehow no one needed more to know. He was the one in command. When his eyes met Luma's, they softened instantly, like coals cooling after a long burn. He dismounted, didn't draw a weapon, and slowly, step by step, he walked, not toward May, but toward Luma. Each footfall seemed to stir something long asleep around the cabin. A gust brushed past May's cheek. A baby bird fluttered off the roof. Light shifted on the ground, and in the exact center of that silent circle, Luma inclined her head. Not a bow, but the greeting of someone who remembers where she came from. May didn't know whether to step back or stay. She only tightened her grip on the doorframe. Not from fear, but from something far more frightening. The fear of being left behind. Luma turned to May, and for the first time in days of silent sharing, her gaze no longer held weariness. It held gratitude, genuine, long enough to say everything words couldn't reach. Part 10, the old man's silent nod. The old don't need stories. They look in a child's eyes and see truth. The elder, the one everyone waited for, though no one introduced, stood in front of the cabin without knocking. His hair was silver white, but neat, eyes deep, but not heavy, and his hands, calloused like bark, hung empty. No weapons, no offerings, just presence. May looked at him. She didn't know whether to bow or step back, but the old man didn't look at her first. He looked down, at the wooden porch where Luma's barefoot prints were still damp. Then his gaze moved, slowly, unhurried. The basket of wild tobacco leaves, the used strips of cloth, the iron bowl still stained with broth, the hearth glowing quietly in the corner. Finally, his eyes settled on the old wool blanket draped over Luma's hair, torn at the edges, unmistakably not hers. No one explained. No one spoke. But the old man understood everything. Luma shifted her swollen leg, pointed to the wound, then reached out and gently touched May's shoulder, and finally laid a hand over her own heart. 3 gestures, no more, but enough to say with clarity deeper than any language. She cared for me, asked for nothing, said nothing, but I am alive because of her. The old man nodded just once, not deep enough to be formal gratitude, not quick enough to be polite reflex, but the kind of nod born from witnessing much grief and knowing that some debts aren't meant to be repaid, only remembered. From the riders behind him, one stepped forward holding a small leather pouch, old, soft, weathered as if passed through many hands. The elder opened it. Inside was a narrow brown cloth, embroidered with blue thread, a pattern like water flowing through reeds, plain, sacred, clearly not made for outsiders. He said nothing of its meaning, did not explain. He only stepped forward and tied it around May's left wrist. May didn't flinch, didn't offer her hand either. She stood still, arms at her sides, trembling only slightly as the cloth touched her skin, cool, but not foreign. When it was tied, the old man looked at her, not down, not with pressure, but with a question. Between you and her, there was a river. Now there is a bridge. Will you cross it? He didn't say savior, didn't call her foster child, didn't say she was good. He let a nod speak for everything, the kind of nod one gives only when age has taught them. Words often fall short of what the soul already knows, and maybe only someone who has known loss could read in those eyes the unspoken message. If your grandmother were alive, she would have done exactly what I did. Luma stepped forward, stood beside May, fingers brushing the cloth on her wrist, then holding the hem of her shirt. She didn't say a word, only looked up, waiting for May to decide. The air lightened. The horses shifted, not loudly, just enough to part slightly, as if making room for a choice. The sky darkened toward evening, but the rain didn't come. And in the wind, soft, strange, familiar, there was the faint scent of dried mint, like the memory of a tea once shared long ago. Part 11. A heart without a name. Not everyone born of the same blood calls each other family. May didn't remember how long she stood still after the brown cloth was tied around her wrist. It wasn't heavy, wasn't tight, just like a very old breeze, so light it felt it might float away, and yet it stayed, quiet, like something that had always belonged. She looked at it, then at Luma, then at the silent circle of people, standing still, not nodding, not urging, just waiting. No one pointed, no one spoke, but none of it was needed, because for the first time in her life, the heart of a child who had lived entirely by survival wanted to stay in a place she didn't build herself. The old man, the one who never gave his name, stepped closer. He didn't ask if she was hungry, didn't ask if she was scared. He simply opened his weathered palm. There, in the center, was a small loop of thread, woven from hair and wool, so aged the color had nearly faded away. He slid it from his own little finger and held it out to May, not as a command, but like a gift she had the right to refuse. The loop was so small it almost vanished in her hand, and yet it was the only thing that day that held a faint red hue, like a bond that had no name, but still felt like kinship. May took it, didn't wear it, just closed her hand around it, like someone holding on to something they'd never had before. Luma stepped forward. She didn't grab it, didn't ask. She simply placed her hand on top of May's, fingers resting gently on the thread. Between the two girls there was no shared blood, no shared surname, no official paper, only a single thread, and a gaze that made neither of them feel like one anymore. From the circle, someone brought forward a horse, small but sturdy, the kind that knew long roads with old rope marks on its back, no saddle, no reins, just a blanket over its back and a cloth sack tied at its side. Inside, May glimpsed half a cornbread loaf, a leather water flask, and a straw doll. No one said, "Come with us," but they didn't have to, because when a child, who once lost everything, finds someone quietly saving them a space beside them, they understand. It may not be family yet, but this is where I'm allowed to stay. Behind her, the riders began to turn their horses, one by one, not with orders or hand signals, but slowly, giving May time to find her own pace. The old man remained last. He placed a weathered hand on Luma's shoulder just for a moment, then tilted his head toward May. Not a nod, not a bow, just a tilt that said, "From now on, you don't have to survive alone." Luma tugged lightly at May's sleeve, then took a step back. May turned to look at the cabin where the last light of day had just touched the doorstep. She didn't know the name for what she was feeling, not joy, not sorrow, but something soft, the kind that makes you breathe gently, walk slower, and let yourself trust, even if just a little. And so, May climbed onto the small horse. No one helped her. She still held the red thread in her hand, and for the first time, she sat behind someone, not holding the reins, not needing to know where the road would lead. In front of her, someone not of her blood, but behind her, the silhouette of a cabin that once held all she knew. And in between was the space people call the place where you've been chosen to stay. Part 12. A choice between two fires. The cold is coming, but colder still is living alone. The horse paused at the crossing of two paths. One led toward the village of the native people, a narrow trail threading through ancient cypress, where dew clung to the grass like the breath of someone who'd just left. The other, back to the cabin. It stood quiet, fragile as a distant thought, perched between coming snows. No one spoke, no one urged. Luma turned, fingers tightening slightly on the worn edge of May's sweater. The elder remained ahead, still on horseback, gaze straight forward. The fire in his eyes wasn't one of hearth or kindling, but the quiet fire of someone who'd lived long enough to know the deepest decisions are often made by the smallest hands. May dismounted, not quickly, not with force, just quietly stepping onto ground soft with early frost. The horse didn't snort or shift, just stood as if it understood. Some footsteps must return, if only to say goodbye the right way. The cabin appeared just as she'd left it. Door still ajar, hearth dark. On the table, 2 bowls, one turned over, one empty, waiting to be filled, or to be washed and put away. May gathered things one by one, unhurried. The old blanket from her grandmother, the slightly bent tin spoon, the half-written notebook on the shelf, the empty herb jar, the one used every winter, now needed by no one. She didn't cry, didn't whisper goodbyes. She only folded a faded linen cloth, the one with pale floral print, and placed it on the table beside a single wildflower. Not for beauty, but because her grandmother once said, "Always leave something living among the things that are old." In the hearth, the coals were cold. May opened an old metal tin, sprinkled what remained of the dried, fragrant leaves, and lit a small fire, not for warmth, but so that anyone passing by, if ever, would know this place had once been a home for 2. The wind slipped through the doorframe, carrying the scent of snow not yet fallen. May touched the wood wall, the one where Luma had drawn the 2 of them sitting by the fire. The sketch had faded in places, but was still clear enough to see that once this was where 2 hearts had relearned how to trust. When she stepped out, the sky was not yet dark, but cold enough to numb her fingers. Luma was still waiting. The elder had not ridden on. May didn't look at anyone right away. She just held the small carved piece of wood, the one Luma had placed in her hand that morning, and gripped it like a key, still holding the echoes of home. She nodded. Just once. No words like "I'm ready." No questions like "Are you sure?" The fire behind her, in the hearth of the old cabin, had just gone out. The fire ahead, in Luma's eyes, had just begun. Between those 2 flames, May chose the one still alive. Part 13. Farewell to one who is no longer here. "Grandma, if you were still alive, what would you say?" Maybe just a quiet nod, like the wind in the evening. May didn't sleep her final night at the cabin, not because of fear, not because of regret, but because in the last quiet hours before a goodbye, we all want to set things right, just once more, before leaving. The fire wasn't lit again. Only the faint scent of warm ashes lingered in the bottom of the hearth. May sat on the floor back against the wall, tying her grandmother's old notebook shut with a thin cord, the same one she used to bundle firewood. Each small item, the bent spoon, the unused patch, the basket of short ropes, she arranged carefully as if saying goodbye, without making a sound. But truly, no sound was needed. Some farewells have no one to hear them, but they still must be made, so the heart doesn't stay tangled in something it can no longer hold. May placed her grandmother's tea bowl back on the table, right in its usual spot. Across from it she set down a smaller bowl, the one she'd used since the day she came to live here. 2 bowls, 2 chairs, one already gone, one about to leave, and between those empty spaces, everything that had once meant home. Before sunrise, May stepped outside. She carried a cloth bag, not filled with much, a blanket, the notebook, a spoon, and a wildflower she had picked from the riverbank the day before. She placed the flower on the table, right between the bowls. Not as an offering, not for mourning, just because It was what Grandma always did when spring returned. A living thing, placed among what was no longer alive. At the threshold, May turned once, not to glance back at the cabin, but to see it fully, like it was the first time. Morning light filtered through the wall slats, catching the cracks in the floor, the faded drawing on the wall, and the smoke stain above the hearth. None of it needed her anymore. And, strangely, that didn't make her heart ache. Just hollow. The gentle kind of hollow. Like the space where someone used to sit. Like a chair that no longer has a name. She stepped out. The door closed behind her. Quietly. The elder stood at a distance, not approaching. Luma had her hands tucked into her sleeves, eyes scattered. Not from cold, but from waiting for something she didn't know how to name. May walked up to her. No words, no hand-holding. She simply placed something small in Luma's palm, a burnt stick. Its tip blackened like the remains of an old fire, but the body of it still dry, still able to burn again. No one said, "Let's go." No one said, "Goodbye." Only the horses shifting under the early light and footsteps pressing softly into dew-wet grass. Behind them, the wooden cabin was no longer a home. Ahead, not yet a destination, but beside them was someone who would walk with them, and sometimes that's enough to call a road, a way home. Part 14, A Day Without a Name, but everyone remembers. No one wrote about May's kindness in the papers, but it lingered in the way the villagers began to look at one another more gently. In the new village, May didn't ask how long it would take to be accepted. She didn't expect it either. For those who have lived too long in silence, just having a place that doesn't push you away is already enough to stay. Every morning, May rose before the rooster. She carried water, learned to set new traps, followed deer prints across the red soil hills. The hands that once only knew how to twist grass by the river now tied braids, knew which bark made stronger bowstrings. The villagers, especially the elders, said little. They watched. They tested her with tasks no one asked for. And no one stopped her from trying. Little by little, May learned how to live, not because someone taught her, but because here, she was no longer alone. Luma still walked slowly, but no longer limped. Still quiet, but her eyes no longer flinched away when meeting someone else's. The village children started to visit, and first it was for the cornbread Luma shared. Later it was for the fire in May's hearth, always lit and always carrying a scent warmer than food, the smell of a place where you're allowed to rest. One cold morning the elder came by. He didn't come in, didn't say much. He simply hung a wooden bowl outside May's door. An old bowl, cracked slightly along the side. It wasn't for eating, and not for display. But by village tradition, a bowl hung at the door means this place is home. May stood behind the door. She didn't step out, but she lifted her hand and gently touched the rim. The bowl made no sound, but inside her something deep rang clear. The sound of someone finally having someone to come home to. In winter evenings, when the coals still gave off gentle warmth, the children gathered around the fire. Luma didn't tell stories, but drew pictures in the ash with a stick. May didn't speak, but added wood to the fire, divided dry bread, and smiled. And slowly, a few in the village began to say, "That night, the night when 30 riders circled the cabin on the edge of the woods. The night when 2 girls slept without crying, without calling, and the fire still burned warm." No one remembered the exact date. No one wrote it down in history. But since that night, people in the village looked at each other more gently, spoke more softly, and left a little food aside for those who hadn't come, as if knowing someone out there might need it. No one named it kindness, but it was there. Like the way sunlight slips through wooden walls, No one sees when it arrives, but everyone feels it when it's there. And one day, when the old ones sit around the fire with children at their feet, they'll say, "There were two children, one pale, one brown, not of the same blood, not of the same language, but they understood each other through a bowl of tea and the warmth of fire." That story should always be told on nights when the wind whispers across wooden roofs. At the edge of a barren land, there are stories no one ever tells. No medals, no legends, only a girl who once lived beside an empty chair, and another who stumbled through pain to her doorstep. There were no oaths between them, only a fire that burned just long enough to warm an unnamed winter. And if you ask, did that really happen? The village children will point to a small bowl hanging outside a wooden door and say, "Here, we don't leave anyone behind if they once shared with us half a bowl of warm soup." If you've ever found yourself staring at an empty chair, if you've ever brewed tea for someone who never came back, leave something below this video. Not words, if you don't want to, just a single dot, so that someone wandering through dust and silence will know you're not alone.